participants to kindly take your seat. I'm also checking with our online two distinguished panelists, Dr. Jaidi Sattar and Dr. Syed Akhtar Mahmood. Are you connected? Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you. And Jaidi bhai, thank you so much. I know that it's too late. It's very late at night at your end. And I'm quite sure for Akhtar bhai too. But thank you so much for
the subject is... yes, thank you for inviting me. And the subject is just too important. And
thank you. So we will start now formally. Okay. So today's this session is on the challenges of export diversification and structural transformation in Bangladesh. I'll be making a presentation here, but we are really delighted to have Dr. Zahid Hussain, former lead economist of the World Bank, to chair this session. And also we have with us here Mr. Nasim Manzoor. We all know him, that the leading private sector specialist in Bangladesh, and he, it's private sector actually, he is very much in the private sector. And he's the managing director of Apex Footwear. And then we have two distinguished panelists who will be joining online. Dr. Jaidi Sattar, Chairman and Chief Executive, Policy Research Institute of Bangladesh, and Dr. Syed Akhtar Mahmood, former lead private sector specialist, the World Bank Group. So I just now hand over the microphone to our honorable chair of this session, Dr. Zahid Hussain, to conduct the session, please.
Thank you, Salim, and good morning. Welcome to this session on export diversification and structural transformation. Let me begin with what motivates choice of a topic like this. Now, if you look at the data, some of the structural indicators, one thing you would notice is that, such as, by structural indicators, I mean the investment to GDP ratio or the trade intensity or the share of industrial employment in total employment. What is striking in this data is that there is progress, but the rate of progress is decreasing. That is a concern when you also keep in mind the fact that these ratios are below levels that are observed across similar geographies and per capita income. So we seem to be tiring a little too early in the process of development. Now, then you ask, well, why exports? Why are we linking export diversification to structural transformation? And I think there have been a lot of research in this, but one of the latest empirical study on the role of export in driving economic expansion, you can find in this book. Salim did not pay me to sell this, but there is a very hard piece of evidence in one of the annexes of the book, which says that if real export per worker increased by 10%, GDP per worker increases by 1.2%. And indeed, if you look at the success, industrial success, lasting ones, in the post-colonial era, it'll be hard to find a case where economic expansion is not driven by exports. And high export orientation, and high export orientation in turn is hard to sustain without export diversification. So these are the facts which motivate the choice of topics, which Professor Salim Raihan would initiate with his presentation, which is very detailed on the lay of the land on export diversification and the state of play on policies and institutions. Our two panelists, Dr. Akhtar Mahmood and Dr. Zaidi Sattar, are avid students in this domain, including the predicaments of our third panelist, Nasim Manzoor, who is active in action in a part of the export land, which is thankfully not landlocked, but it is policy locked. So I would now, we will open the discussion to the floor after we hear from the three panelists. So let me now hand over to Professor Salim Raihan for his presentation.
Thank you, Honorable Chair. So here, as Dr. Jahid Hussain, he was mentioning the whole motivation behind this presentation or this discussion is that Bangladesh, as we all know, that it has a very concentrated export basket. But there are serious challenges now in terms of structural transformation and whether the pace has slowed down. Please. So whether the pace has slowed down and then what needs to be done, and whether export diversification can be used as a very important instrument for further structural transformation. And we all know from the literature is that how important is structural transformation when it comes to improving people's livelihood and the kind of betterment in terms of poverty elevation, in terms of employment generation, in terms of course, per capita income growth. So in this presentation, what I'll do, I'll have a mix of kind of data analysis. At the same time, I'll lead you to kind of empirical work, which I am now currently doing. But a bit of that empirical work I'll be presenting, not full because I'm still working with that kind of econometric part. So here we know that while the ready-made garments, RMG, for the non-Bangladeshi audience, you know the RMG we use for as ready-made garments, so is the champion. So Bangladesh's success in export diversification is unsatisfactory. And you can see this export basket is very different from its competitors. So look at Bangladesh's export basket, look at India's, look at Vietnam, look at Thailand. It's very different, Bangladesh. And that's why probably Bangladesh appeared as a kind of outlier. I'm not showing this graph here, but if you plot the cross-country scatter plot, where you have manufacturing value added, as a percentage of GDP, that means industrialization as it happens. And then if you had textile or ready-made garments share in manufacturing value added, you will see that the countries there is a kind of association, the countries who are making progress in industrialization, they are reducing their dependence on textile and clothing. That means they are reducing that. They are diversifying away. In that plot, Bangladesh appears as a super outlier. Bangladesh is nowhere in that kind of fitted line. So I'll come back to that point. And if we look at the Bangladesh export concentration, and this data is taken from the UNCTAD, and they actually provide the construct data of export concentration. We know that how this export concentration index is constructed, HHI, Hirschman index. And then this export concentration, if you look at the top line, and this is exceedingly, is very high, and compared to the LDC average, compared to India, compared to Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, so it's very high. But this table is very interesting. This table shows that between 2006 and 2021, at the 4-digit HS code level, Bangladesh added only 9 products in its export basket. And if you look at the latest figure, the 2021 figure, those 9 products actually amounted to $823 million, the export. And look at Vietnam. During the same period, they added 41 new product export item, and with those 41 new products added $145 billion export in 2021. And you can see the the success of India and Thailand too. And Bangladesh is nowhere closer to this performance. So that means this is a very long period of time the country has not been successful in diversifying its export basket. And also, Bangladesh has not really been able to enjoy what you call the dynamic comparative advantage. So if you look at this data is from using 3-digit SITC code and the comparison between Bangladesh and Vietnam, and look at the flat line Bangladesh, the number of products where Bangladesh has revealed comparative advantage greater than or equal to 1, and look at Vietnam, growing and very, escalating trend. That means Vietnam, starting from a low base, but was able to enjoy more and more dynamic comparative advantage and added new products in its export basket, where we are still struggling. And just very quickly, just to show you the difference between Bangladesh export basket and Vietnam's in terms of economic complexity. Those who are aware of this economic complexity index, this is Harvard, MIT, they actually, is Ricardo Hosmans and David Hidalgo. They actually constructed this. It's a very detailed work where the idea is the products which country export, how complex these products are. If you are less complex, that means kind of simple products, this is yellowish color. If you are more complex products, more sophisticated, more value added, you get into the bluish part. Bangladesh's export basket is mostly yellow part, whereas if you look at the Vietnam's export basket, it's a highly contrasting picture you can see. So now the question is, and we know that the LDC graduation is very imminent now in November 2026. Bangladesh is actually going to graduate out from the LDC status. So is Bangladesh's export sector ready to face post-LDC graduation challenges? So now I will highlight some of the important challenges which are actually restricting export diversification. And I think it's not only restricting export diversification, but also restricting overall economic progress. So this figure is taken from World Bank Enterprise Survey, the latest one, 2022, where I actually collected the information, identified the export-oriented firms, and whether their perspectives on challenges, and which are the areas where they found, where they mentioned the obstacles were there. And you can see that the top obstacles were price and availability of raw materials, customs and trade regulations, port facilities, tax system, skilled labor, financing, and then you can see that other issues are like standard and certification, business licensing, transport, court system. Legal system is also kind of complicated there too. So this is the kind of perspective from the enterprises. But now coming to more specifically on the policy and regulatory issues, in Bangladesh, the import tariff remains still very high. So I'm comparing, if you look at the horizontal axis, the tariff rate in 1990 and tariff rate in 2020, and you look at the cross line where Bangladesh is there, and actually still, in 1990, Bangladesh had one of the highest tariff rate in the world, average tariff rate. Even in 2020, apart from those few countries above, Bangladesh maintained a very high average tariff rate, and which is no way useful or helpful for diversification of export. And even if we get into more nitty-gritty of these tariff rates, what we call the share of tariffs line with international peaks. International peaks mean if you have a tariff line more than 15% of duty, those are the very high tariff rates. You can see in 2020, Bangladesh had more than 40% of its tariff line with a rate more than 15%. And where you can see its competitors. India had 10.6, Vietnam 14.4, and Malaysia and Thailand much lower than Bangladesh. Also now moving to other policy and regulatory issues, Bangladesh ranks poorly in the ease of paying taxes. This is the survey conducted by PwC, and you can see Bangladesh's ranking is one of the worst compared to many of its competitors. Now coming to other policy issue, it is the kind of exchange rate. And this is something, I think it was poorly managed, improperly managed for years after years in Bangladesh. So this index I constructed considering the exchange rate in 2010 as 100, and then you construct the index, like how it moved. Look at the blue line, the Bangladesh, that's the lowest line, where you can see for a considerable number of years, the country maintained a so-called stable exchange rate, but it was flat, it was artificially maintained there. And then look at the jump there, the recent jump, around 30% jump, because then within a very short time, the country had to adjust. And we know all the situation of Hawaii, that exchange rate had to adjust. So if it were allowed, during that period to gradually adjust to the market-based interest exchange rate, I think we wouldn't have faced this kind of situation now. Coming to other issue, when you look at the policy, that the ineffective monetary policy to contain inflation. Remember, the firms, they mentioned that a price hike was another problem they faced, one of the obstacles, important obstacles. Look at this figure, where the inflation rate was growing, but that interest rate was kept fixed at 9% for a long period of time. And it doesn't make any sense. When you have this inflation and you use the monetary policy, interest rate is one of the important monetary policy instrument, and that was very poorly or ineffectively used to contain the inflation. Now coming to the kind of institutional aspect of this policy and regulatory issues, this data is taken from the World Governance Indicators for the data for 2021, and there is a poor quality of formal institutions, in particular the regulatory quality. In all these 6 indicators, you see that Bangladesh's performance much poorer than other countries. But if you look at the government effectiveness or regulatory quality, and of course the control of corruption as well, the performance is very poor. Now then, we know that the very common problem of financing, and that is extremely important for export diversification. We know the challenges here is there, high rate of non-performing loan, weak capital market. I'm not really getting into the details because I know our distinguished panelists will actually shed light on these points. And then we also have weak financial penetration. How do we define weak financial penetration? The domestic credit to the private sector by banks % of GDP. And Bangladesh's performance or ratio is much lower than lower middle income country average, lower than the South Asian average, and leave alone the world average. In terms of trade logistics, this is taken from the Logistic Performance Index of World Bank. And you can see in 2000, I'm comparing 2 periods, between 2007 and 2023. And you can see the red line is actually the world average. And even we know that there have been some improvements in logistic performance or trade logistics, but still in 2023, Bangladesh's performance is much lower than the world average. And you can see the other countries, Vietnam, India, they actually moved up during this period, but we are still lagging behind. These are the 6 indicators I'm really going through, that the 6 sub-indicators of logistic performance, the story remains the same. And we know the kind of challenges of skilled workforce availability. And if you compare the labor productivity of Bangladesh, if you compare Bangladesh as one, India's average labor productivity is 37% higher than Bangladesh's. And you can see Vietnam's 35% higher, and the other countries like China, Malaysia, and Thailand probably much higher, the productivity. And there is a serious skill gap in almost all sectors of the export-oriented sectors. Why this skill gap? Why this low productivity? We know there are many reasons, but I'm just wanting to identify one particular area, the very poor public spending on health and education. And you can see that this is not a 1 year or 2 years problem. It's a common problem. This is the data for 2 decades. And Bangladesh's public expenditure education is the lowest compared to lower middle income country average, compared to LDC average, compared to South Asia average. And the same story is in the case of health expenditure. And I actually called it as a policy paralysis in one of my articles. Because the policy paralysis is that because it's the common phenomena. And we don't know whether this situation is going to change. There will be a dramatic change in this scenario, both in terms of public spending on health and education. We don't know, whether there's something going to happen in future. So the core economic challenges remain. We know that there is a stagnant private sector investment regime. Bangladesh has one of the lowest tax GDP ratio in the world. If you compare Bangladesh with the similar sizes of countries in terms of GDP, the country has one of the lowest tax GDP ratios in the world. There is a falling trend in foreign reserve, and that's adding to the macroeconomic crisis. And one of the very important problems is that the very low FDI. And if you compare Bangladesh with other countries, FDI as % of GDP is very, very low. So that is also kind of constraining its attempts to diversify its export basket countries like Vietnam and many of the Southeast Asian countries, they used FDI to diversify their export basket because many new investment actually came in those countries into new sectors. But Bangladesh hasn't been able to exploit that opportunity yet. So now I come to my last part of my presentation. I know I had around 8 minutes, something like 8 to 10 minutes. So I will, yeah? Less than that, yeah. No, yeah, I know. So I'm looking at the watch. So yeah, I'll be able to exhaust that time anyway. So as our chair, he was mentioning that the importance of structural transformation and how we can fit this discussion of export diversification into this whole broad discourse on structural transformation. To have this to have a meaningful discussion, what I did, I actually constructed an index of structural transformation. So how do you do that? So I'm not really getting into the very theoretical aspect of it because I don't have time, but if any question during the question answer session, I can get into that. But I used 3 indicators which actually relate to those theoretical discussions. What I use, the 3 indicators, one is that the share of manufacturing value added in GDP. So that means what is your manufacturing share in GDP? Then the data on manufacturing share in employment is actually not readily available for a large number of countries. So to actually have that aspect, I use the share of industrial employment in total employment. So that is also kind of, it shows that how the employment is moving from agriculture to non-agricultural sector. But these 2 indicators are not enough because in many empirical literature on structural transformation, they actually use these 2 indicators, mostly these 2 indicators, to show structural transformation. These 2 indicators are not enough because why? The reason is most advanced countries now, they are experiencing the phases of deindustrialization. It's a natural deindustrialization. They're moving away from industry towards services sectors. Now, if I use these two indicators, the problem is I will face that the structural transformation of these countries are actually declining or they are reversing their structural transformation, which is not. So then that's why I added the 3rd indicator for what is called the economic complexity index. I actually introduced this idea in my previous slides, which shows that the kind of products the countries are exporting, how complex these products are. And you can see the more advanced countries, they're actually exporting more complex products. And that is related to their historically the transformed economies. So that's why I use these 3 and actually rescale the economic complexity index between 0 and 100. I assign equal weights among these 3 indicators, and I constructed the index for the period between 1995 and 2021, 27 years for 133 countries. Let's have a look at these 3 countries now, the trend for these 3 countries. So here you can see that 3 countries, Bangladesh and Vietnam, they actually had a similar level of structural transformation, but then these 2 countries are actually having divergent experience, where Bangladesh, as Dr. Jahid Hussain, he was mentioning, the progress has slowed down, the structural transformation in Bangladesh, where, can I have the slide please? Where the progress has slowed down, you can see that it has escalated for Vietnam. For India as well, it increased, but at a very slower pace than Vietnam. Now what I did, so I actually used the data for 2021 and plotted my constructed index of structural transformation against the export concentration ratio of UNCTAD. And you can see there is a nice, plot. So here the red dot is Bangladesh, and you can see the export concentration ratio is on the horizontal axis, and structural transformation index is on the vertical axis. And this is a plot for 2021, and if I add one regression line, a fitted line, you can see there is a nice fit trend line where more concentration of export basket leads to lower structural transformation. So what I did, I actually tried to do a kind of analysis using this structure. I actually came up with some structural block. So what is that? Here, the countries with, so here the export concentration is divided into three parts: low, high, and exceedingly high. Bangladesh actually belongs to high export concentration. And then for the structural transformation, three parts: low, medium, moderate, and high. So what I'm saying, for the countries which are having high and extremely high export concentration, but low structural transformation, I'm suggesting that they should have strategic kind of industrial policy. What is that strategic policy? That mostly these are sub-Saharan African countries. They have limited resources. They can't actually have broad-based industrial policy. They need to target few sectors. But for the corner, advancing, mostly the oil-rich countries, where they also have very high level of export concentration, and but they have resources. So they can actually diversify away from the oil-based sector to more, and the recent example is Saudi Arabia, you know that, the way they are trying to move away from oil-based sector. Then this part here, this part of the countries where they have low export concentration, but moderate structural transformation, and it's actually India belongs here, where I'm saying that it can be upgraded. That means they have already have some success in terms of structural transformation. What they really need to do, they need to actually based on their success, they need to advance or upgrade their success. The left corner is the tech frontier countries. Tech frontiers are actually those who have already achieved a very high level of structural transformation with a low, I'm finishing in 1 minute, with a low export concentration, but they are now investing more on technological or research and innovative products. But the problem is for Bangladesh, you see, where the box where Bangladesh belongs to, not many countries are there. And that's why probably it can kind of say that Bangladesh is an outlier in many of these cases, where Bangladesh has some success in structural transformation, but at the same time, Bangladesh is actually having a high level of export concentration. And for that, I'm suggesting here the country needs to have a broad-based industrial policy. You can't just rely on a single product, like ready-made garments. You have to diversify away that product. So how the movement between 1995 and 2021, and you can see a very interesting picture. Bangladesh in 1995 was here and moved to here in 2021. Vietnam was at the same level of Bangladesh in 1995, but Vietnam moved here. And India had a movement between 95 and 2021. So now Bangladesh has an option. Can Bangladesh move up to have a higher structural transformation by following? Bangladesh actually had a higher structural transformation with have a more concentrated export basket. Can it follow the same path? That will take Bangladesh there, or go straight there, or go to the left. But the problem is Bangladesh can't do that. Why? That's my last point, is that if you forget these countries, Bahrain, because I think that was more of a data error, there is no country here. There is no country here too. You can't actually have a higher level of structural transformation keeping the same level of export concentration. You have to move to left anyway to have a higher structural transformation. I'll stop here and thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you. Salim Raihan has painted a broad canvas covering a number of critical issues, incentives, and what I would call sludges in our institutional system, which make it difficult to achieve what the government wants you to achieve. And then he also has identified some roadblocks to export diversification, and finally spelled out a few options on how should we go about doing this. Now let me turn to Dr. Akhtar Mahmood. I can't see him on the screen yet, but if Akhtar, if you're hearing me.
I am here. I'm very much here.
I know you must have planned your own presentation, but I would like to draw your attention to one of the slides which Salim has presented, which is on the quality of formal institutions. And I'm drawing your attention because you have a lot of experience in this area. where, we have a puzzle that we say quality of regulation is poor, government effectiveness is low, corruption is high. And we know that these are not independent of each other. Poor regulation leads to low government effectiveness, opens up opportunities for corruption, but then opportunities of corruption block reforms to regulatory systems, which perpetuate low government effectiveness. So the question I want you to address, in addition to what you want to say, is how do we get out of this vicious cycle where intended nudges become sludges? Okay, Attar, to you.
Thank you very much. So first, I'd like to thank Sanem and Professor Selim Raihan for giving me this unique opportunity to join this very distinguished panel. I presume I have about 10 minutes to make my observations. I do have a few slides. Sorry, 10 minutes you said, Dr. Hussain?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So I will address the issue that you mentioned towards the end, but let me also just share a few slides. And I know that Selim has already compared Bangladesh to Vietnam, so I may be duplicating a little bit, but I'll start with that. But first, a point on the economic complexity. It's interesting that if we go back 30 years to 1995, Bangladesh actually ranked higher than Vietnam, better than Vietnam on the economic complexity index. So Bangladesh was actually about 85 or so, and Vietnam was 107th in the ranking, so behind Bangladesh. But around 2018 or so, that's the year for which I have data. I know Selim Raihan had more recent data. Vietnam had advanced to a rank of about 42, and Bangladesh had declined to a rate of about 107, which is where Vietnam was about 30 years ago. So that's one example of the divergent paths that Bangladesh and Vietnam has taken. But I'd like to share two more slides comparing Bangladesh and Vietnam. So let me just put them up here. Okay, so this one is on the electronics exports. And you can see in 95, both in absolute terms, the figure here is the electronic export value as share of total exports, but also in absolute terms, Bangladesh and Vietnam are more or less in the same position. Electronics was under 1% of total exports for both Vietnam and Bangladesh. In fact, Bangladesh was slightly higher, 0.7%, Vietnam 0.4%. But then you see how the trajectories differ. And in fact, in the last 15 years or so, it has differed in a very, very radical manner. So now electronics constitute about, well, in 2018, the data that I have, more than 35% of Vietnam's exports. For Bangladesh, it is still under 1%. In fact, in percentage terms, even less than it was in 1995. In absolute terms, the electronics exports were about $30 million for both the countries in 1995. In Bangladesh, I think it has grown to just about 70 or so. And in Vietnam, I actually have the figure here, which is about more than $100 billion. So again, a very dramatic change in the trajectories of electronics, which is one of the complex products that Selim Raihan was referring to. Now, what is the reason for this? And Selim Raihan alluded to the role of to it, and that's the role of FDI. So if we look at the FDI picture, sorry, this is here. Again, Bangladesh and Vietnam 30 years ago were roughly at the same position. FDI as percentage of GDP was just about a little over 0.5% or so. But then you see the orange line is Vietnam and Bangladesh is the blue line. There has been some modest increases in recent years in FDI inflows in Bangladesh, but it's nothing like Vietnam. So FDI has been a major driver of Vietnam's export diversification. In fact, I think about 70%, I have a figure here, 70% of the electronics exports of Vietnam comes from foreign investors. I'll give you the exact figure here in a moment. Yes, 70% of total exports come from foreign investors in Vietnam. So that's a striking illustration of the role that foreign investment plays and the striking difference between the volume of FDI inflows into Bangladesh versus Vietnam. Now, in Bangladesh, we do talk a lot about bringing FDI, but we don't talk enough about the composition of the FDI that's coming in. So even within the moderate increase that we see, there is a problem. Now, those who work on FDI, they make a distinction between three types of motivations that encourage foreign investors to come in. So you have the natural resource-seeking investors who are primarily interested in exploiting the natural resources of the countries they go into. Then you have the market-seeking investors who are primarily interested in the domestic market. So, for example, investors who come in to invest in the power sector or the telecom sector or the banking sector of Bangladesh are primarily interested in the domestic market. They could also be investing in consumer products which are mainly marketed in Bangladesh. What Bangladesh really needs are the ones which will help us get a footprint in global value chains. So we need export-oriented investment, or what is often called efficiency-seeking investment. So they see Bangladesh as an efficient production base, whether because of low costs or because of other advantages. So they use Bangladesh as the base from which they would export, at least to the region, if not to the whole globe. So that's called efficiency-seeking investment. So where do we stand on that? So here I have a comparison between 2012, 2019, and 2022. And the first set of bars are the natural resource seeking, roughly around 20%. A large part of it is the kind of Chevron type investments that we have seen. And by the way, I just want to mention something. We often hear that the US is the largest investor in Bangladesh. And recently, when I opened my Twitter account, there was a tweet from the US Embassy asking this rhetorical question: do you know that the US is the largest investor in Bangladesh? Yes, if you take the stock, but much of it, 70% or more, is of the natural resource seeking type. So not a great player when it comes to the future of Bangladesh, Bangladesh's development, where we really need more efficiency-seeking, export-oriented investment. As you can see, the bulk of the investment is market-seeking, and the third set of bars, which is efficiency-seeking, the proportion is low to begin with, and in fact, declining over time. Now, that third set of bars is what we want to increase. We want to increase the volume of investment, foreign investment coming into efficiency-seeking sectors. Now, what are the bottlenecks? Why are foreign investors discouraged from coming here? The World Bank did. Okay, I'm actually just have two more slides, and this actually will probably help answer the question that you had, Dr. Zahid Hussain, and you're familiar with this work because I think you had used it in one of your publications. This is something I had done about 4 or 5 years ago, based on a survey of investors on the subject of regulatory uncertainty. Because global surveys of CEOs of multinational corporations have shown that policy and regulatory uncertainty is one of the big problems discouraging foreign investors. So where do we stand in Bangladesh? This is not necessarily a survey of foreign investors. This is about investors in general. And what we see here is we basically, in the survey, presented 6 statements to the respondents, the businesses, and they were asked to say whether they agree that this is a problem or whether they disagree this is a problem. And one was whether rules and regulations are often announced without prior notice, consultation, or impact assessments. About 40% agreed, about 35% disagreed. So not that serious a problem compared to the other ones. Many laws in Bangladesh are inconsistent with each other. About 70% of the respondents agreed with that statement. Finding information on existing rules and regulations is generally a major obstacle for doing business. Again, more than 50%. about 60% said that regulatory officials use a lot of undue discretion in dealing with businesses. Another 50% says the lack of effective grievance mechanisms is a major obstacle. And adverse policy or regulatory changes often make costs and revenue streams very uncertain. So a general consensus that regulatory uncertainty is a big problem. And we also had some estimates of how much that is discouraging investments from actually moving forward. So this is one of the examples of where the quality of regulations, as manifested in uncertainty, is discouraging not only domestic investors, but as I said, this is a major deterrent for foreign investors. I'd just like to add, I'd like to end with just one slide on the subject of diversification. Here I've looked at 5 products, 5 non-traditional garment products, and just look at the trajectory. There, until about 2006, these 5 products, the volume was more or less the same. And then we see a couple of products making a breakthrough. So we have women's knitted suits, which is the one in green, and men's knitted undergarments, the one in blue. Those have taken off. But there are 2 others, the dotted ones, gloves and men's woven undergarments. They have remained sort of stagnant. What this tells us is that there are products, new products, even in the garment sector, that our entrepreneurs are going into. But in some cases, they're able to make a breakthrough and rapidly expand their exports. In many other cases, they are not, despite having some competitive advantage, because other than that, they could not have made the breakthrough. But having made a breakthrough, they can't then expand their exports. And that's a question that I think we economists must also pose, that what is it that's stopping people from, after having made a breakthrough, after having made an entry into a new market with a new product, they're actually not able to do what some of the other products have done, which is rapidly replicate, rapidly expand their products. So let me end there. I think I've run out of time, but thank you again for the opportunity to make these brief comments.
Thank you. Thank you, Akhtar. I think I'll pick up on his last point, because one of the findings of a recent country economic memorandum done by the World Bank was also the survival rate of new export is extremely low. We have a large number of exports, but they come in and they go. And I turn now to Nasim Manzoor. And I would like to draw your attention to another slide of Selim, which was on the perception of exporters, where he presented data on the enterprise survey of the World Bank. And what is striking in that is that the top 4 do not include incentive issues, which economists emphasize, like high protection and overvalued exchange rate. So there is this apparent disconnect between what exporters perceive as the main barriers and what economists emphasize as the incentive problems. Now, is it because the incentive distortions are easier to manage, for example, through subsidies and other benefits from the government, but the skill shortages and this availability problems or logistical issues are harder to surmount on their own? Or maybe the economists are missing the big elephants in the room?
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you to Sanem for inviting me to this very important panel, something that we have been working on for a long time. I'm deeply conscious of the fact that I'm the only panelist without a PhD here, so I have to be careful what I say in a room full of economists. Honorable Chair, Dr. Zahid Hussain, Dr. Selim Rehan, Dr. Zaidi Sattar, Dr. Syed Akhtar Mahmood, as well as guests, ladies and gentlemen. Before I answer the question, I think I'd like to thank Dr. Selim Rehan, who's been a great proponent of trying to sort of make those who don't want to listen, listen. And we are still having that fight, and we will go on. So I think, when we talk about export diversification, I'd like to share some empirical data, because I think it's quite revealing. As we all know, RMG is something like 83% of Bangladesh's total national exports. And the sector that I proudly represent, leather and leather product, we are only about 2.2% at the moment. And that's as a country. But if you look at this entity called the Export Processing Zones of Bangladesh, where the rules are the same for everybody. It doesn't matter whether you're an RMG factory, or you're a fishing rod factory, or a sleeping bag factory, or a shoe factory, or a porcelain factory. It's exactly the same privileges. It's exactly the same rules. There, the share of non-RMG is 55%. So, I don't have a PhD and I can't do the fancy modeling that Salim Bhai can do, but as a layman, that tells me everything I need to know. If you treat people equally, performance can be equal, if not equal, quite close. So when you have an 80-20 skew outside the EPZ, where 80% is RMG and 20% is not, but inside the EPZ, it's 45-55. That tells us everything we need to know. Why is that? What happens inside the EPZ that's so magical? Everybody gets treated the same. It's the same rate of interest, it's the same labor standards, it's the same customs clearance, it's the same way to open an account, it's the same labor standards, it's the same way to remit your money. Everything is exactly the same. So I don't think it's a non-brainer. It's a no-brainer to actually figure that out. Now, when you talk about what has been happening, I think in the quest for export diversification, let me start with some good news, because I think I have a reputation for bringing only bad news. There is some good news. I think after many years of screaming from the rooftops, we see some changes. We see, for example, and I know the exact date, 14th of January, the Honorable Prime Minister actually said publicly that there are 3 sectors, jute, agro, and the leather sector, which I represent, should be treated exactly the same as RMG. Why these 3 sectors? Value addition, job creation, local content. So I think when that announcement was made, this was a bit of a game changer. And we've seen, for example, from the NBR recently, duty-free raw materials, for example, for certain sectors. They will provide all export-oriented sectors the same facilities as RMG. This was announced on the 7th of February. On the 12th of February, similar facilities like passbooks were given to non-RMG. On 30th of January, the bonded warehouse license, which is a license we all need to bring raw materials in for garments, was always 3 years. For everybody else was 2 years. That has now been equalized at 3 years. So we are seeing a movement in the right direction. Is it a little bit too little, too late? I don't think so, but I think it needs to be accelerated. Now, what remains to be done? Let me give you again data from the ground. The audit, for example, for the RMG license, bonded warehouse license, is every 2 years. For everybody else, it's every 1 year. These are all costs of doing business, ease of doing business impediments, which comes to your point about incentives versus other. I'm not surprised to see that response from businesses saying our biggest problem, in fact, the second biggest problem is basically regulatory. How do you deal with overregulation? Now, I love the policy paralysis term that Salim Bhai came up with. I would say that there is policy paralysis not only because of the incredibly low spending on education and health, also there has been no policy reform in the ease of doing business space. Let's talk about policy innovation in customs and clearing. If you had seen that slide where there was a scatter slides, one of the biggest problems that we have versus Vietnam is the complexity in importing raw material. Let me give you a real-life example from a joint venture company that we are involved in Bangladesh. They have factories in Vietnam, factory in Bangladesh. In Vietnam, when you import a container load of raw materials, the packing list is 2 pages because the level of detail is not how many zippers, what is the length, and what is each color of zipper. It's just you have X number of zippers. In Bangladesh, the same container is a 12-page document. Who is looking at this data? What are they doing with this data? We have no idea. So this is where I think reform is needed to how to demystify, make it easier, simplify these rules, which is why we're all struggling with that. Because those are not areas where we can innovate. Now, Bangladeshi exporters, and I totally agree with your statement, and as well as was pointed out by Dr. Salim Ryan, export is important not only for the dollars that it brings. It's important for the connectivity to the global value chain. It's important for the technology that it brings. It's also important for the jobs that it creates. Now, Dr. Salim Rehan mentioned that as countries progress, you move away from what we call the cutting and stitching operations, right? If you look at what China did, they moved the maximum number of people out of poverty in the history of mankind by using cutting and stitching operations. RMG, stuffed toys, and footwear. Stuffed toys in Bangladesh never happened because of customs and NBR, I would say, lack of understanding of that industry. Footwear is languishing at $1.7 billion. It's nothing. It's a $365 billion business, and we have a $1.7 billion. It's nothing. So if you can innovate and bring new ways to simplify bringing this in, it's very important. The Vietnam example is also very important, and I'm thankful to Dr. Akhtar for pointing this out. 72.3% exactly of all Vietnam export is FDI driven. And I was very disappointed. I was at a seminar I would say about 2-3 years ago, and a very senior government official actually said that we don't need FDI. And I think I was shocked. But that has changed. We have seen now that I think everybody understands the value of FDI. We need FDI not just for the dollars. We need it for the connection to the global value chain. We need it for bringing the supply chain to Bangladesh. We need it for the marketing ability. You see, when you are part of a global value chain, you're able to achieve higher unit price on your exports. What was missing in this discussion till date, I think, is also the value of exports. And I know Dr. Ryan has worked on this. If you look at the unit price of exports from Bangladesh, it's much lower in garments than it is from Vietnam, because we are still doing mainly cotton-based, and the world has moved to synthetic-based. So higher value as well as volume is very, very important. Now, very quickly, I think coming to your point about, what is it that we struggle with the most? Can we innovate our way out of the other problems? I think it's also changed. Up till the point where labor costs were artificially held down, like our currency was artificially held down, you could kind of arbitrage your lower labor costs against all other inefficiencies and get away with it. But as Bangladesh progresses into middle income status, you will have to raise wages, and wages have to reach living wage standards. So that inefficiency cannot be arbitraged now by using labor. So if you cannot improve efficiency across the value chain, you will not be competitive. And that's where the premature slowing down, the middle income country trap, all of these terms that we know are a genuine risk for Bangladesh. I would like to end with something I think Dr. Akhtar said very, very, very important, which is regulatory uncertainty. I think he hit the nail on the head. Let me again give you real life examples, because I work in the real life world of this. We have on export a tax at source. So for every $1 that we export, a certain percentage is deducted when we export as an advance tax. Now that tax is never refunded. You can never pay enough tax. That's a separate discussion. 1 year to the other, it can go up as much as 100%. So you've built a factory, you've done your costing for 1 year, you're assuming that the tax is 0.5%. At the next budget, it can go up to 1%. But you can't renegotiate the prices. You can't renegotiate with your buyers. So if you don't have that kind of certainty, do you think foreign investors are going to look at that and think, well, this is a place I want to do business? So I think regulatory predictability, regulatory traceability, was it, where is it now, that is very, very important. I think last but not least, I think, how did Vietnam catch up? This is the million-dollar question, or billion-dollar question we keep talking about. It has to start with policy reform. And I will say again and again, other than the back-to-back LC and the bonded warehouse license, both of which were done many decades ago, I have not recently seen a lot of innovation happening in how you can make export raw material sourcing easier for Bangladesh, which is why it came up highest on that survey that you did. So as the world now tries to localize the supply chain, we need to really, really look at how do you simplify bringing in the raw materials that you need to be able to export out. There are very simple methods that are being followed in Sri Lanka. And recently, on a concluding note, the country that is really transforming from the logistics index to the ease of doing business to the value chain is India. I'll tell you honestly, we never considered India as a competitor for the manufacturing export industry. India is a serious player right now. There's the highest amount of interest right now in moving into India because the states are incentivized to compete against each other to attract investment. If Tamil Nadu is giving you a 22% rate, Gujarat is coming with a different rate. If Bihar is offering you 6 months payback of salaries if you create new jobs, West Bengal, the great West Bengal is coming back and competing with that. So they are taking a page out of the China playbook, and they're actually using incentives to attract FDI to create jobs, to drive exports. Bangladesh can and will need to do the same if we want to get out of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Naseem. I think after hearing you, I realized that not having a PhD can be a blessing. Because you really get to know the reality better. Now let me turn to Dr. Zaidi Sattar, whose research on trade spans several generations now. And I would like to draw your attention to Salim's revealed comparative advantage finding, because I think Policy Research Institute has also done several studies on that, and the bottom line conclusion from that research, which I saw in Sadiq Ahmed's recently published book, was that competitiveness of Bangladesh sheep export is not really an issue. The issue is incentives and all these trade facilitation barriers and so on. So, but I think Salim's finding also makes us think like a devil's advocate, that suppose we have limited comparative advantage in a limited number of products. The question then arises, are we specializing enough? I mean, we could still say that maybe the garment has not peaked yet, or the peak of garment is not in the rear view mirror. And one other statement on which I would like Zaidi Bhai to comment on is that I think the export promotion policies in Bangladesh are exporter friendly, not necessarily export friendly, because we pick winners. So over to you, Dr. Zaidi Sattar.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Zahid, for this kind introduction, and I echo your point about not having a PhD might be a blessing. Having listened to Naseem Manzoor, his practical experience and practical perspectives, PhD is no match to that kind of practical experience. So thank you, Naseem, for bringing us to the real world. Salim also deserves commendation. After all, he always brings in new approaches, and here he's brought in this export concentration problem. He's linked it to what he called the lack of structural transformation. I guess what it means is a lack of economic diversification for the whole economy, and that is a problem. What I would have liked to hear is where he thinks the problem lies, what is undermining, what is preventing the economic diversification and structural transformation. On your suggestion to say something on the RCA, Salim, I have some differences in this. I understand you looked at the revealed comparative advantage analysis using at the 4-digit level. Now, at the 4-digit level, it's too much aggregation. You need to get into at least the 6-digit, HS 6-digit level, a more disaggregated exercise. And Balasa's revealed comparative advantage has been extended actually by what is called the normalized RCA, NRCA. The interesting thing is this: when you do NRCA, you can do RCA. You can say if it's greater than 1, we have comparative advantage in those products, but it doesn't tell you how strong is that comparative advantage, or what is the relative competitive advantage when you are competing with other exporters. So normalized RCA, NRCA, when you develop that index for all the products, you can then compare with other countries like Vietnam and China, and then figure out where Bangladesh stands. So we did that. We have done a very detailed exercise. You see, let's not give a sweeping statement saying that we don't have too many products with comparative advantage. We exported a total of 1,700 plus export products in 2021, of which 216 HS6 products were ready-made garment, and about 1,500 was non-garment, okay, at the HS6 digit level. And we looked at, the NRCA, normalized real comparative advantage, not only for the ready-made garment sector, where we found, 90% of RMG, we have they are highly competitive relative to our competitors who export to the same markets. In the case of non-RMG, there again, we found fairly high, out of the 1,500, at least 500 HS6 products that we export, we found to be highly or moderately competitive with our competitors who supply to the same destination markets. And that is revealing because that is why I think you mentioned Dr. Sadiq's paper, which is based on our research, which says that competitiveness is really not the issue. And these are static competitive advantage estimations. In a dynamic sense, actually, we have been, on average, exporting 1,500 non-garment products throughout the past 20 years. Okay, so it's not that we don't have products to export and we don't. The issue is, why are these non-garment products not expanding or growing faster? And which Naseem Manzoor gave the good news, which is, and something that I've been saying for a long time, that give the other export products the same facilities as the ready-made garment sector. That is the issue. So I'm going to, rather than beat around the bush at this time of night, which is very late. So I have drafted a 2-page note, which I'm going to read in the next 7-8 minutes, which is why I requested about 15 minutes of your time. So I'm going to just summarize my viewpoint on this particular challenge of export diversification. What is the challenge? What is the fundamental problem, and what are the policy solutions? Okay, and my research and my thinking has evolved over the last 25 years. First, I argued that there was an anti-export bias, which comes from our protective tariff structure, which is very high, and which Salim also acknowledged. It's a very high protective structure, which creates disincentives for exports. That was the first thing. But it evolved into the fact that we said that actually this anti-export bias is not affecting the ready-made garment export performance. It is affecting non-ready-made garment performance. So this anti-export bias was limited to the non-garment sector. And the next evolution was that I was arguing that this anti-export bias arising from currently high protective tariff structure has become a binding constraint on export diversification, which we have been trying to do for the last 20 years, but with no success. So here's my key points, key findings from the research that we have done. Extensive research we've done on 1,500 or so. Actually, it is a fact that on average, we export 1,500 plus non-garment exports in the past 20 years. The number of HS6 ready-made garment products is 216. By HS6 product, I mean, a shirt, a pair of trousers, a jacket, a cap. These are different HS codes. These are different products. That is how we look at it. Now, let me read, in the next 7-8 minutes, this 2-page notice I have drafted. Despite placing very high priority on the goal of export diversification, not much progress has been achieved in the past 2 decades. The export concentration continues. Quite rightly, government of Bangladesh is eager to find out what constrains the diversification of our export basket and what should be done about it as LDC graduation draws near. based on past research. Okay. As part of my ongoing research focus, I have studied the challenge of export diversification in the Bangladesh context and recognized that lack of export product diversification is the result of a policy problem, not a matter of competitiveness or lack of domestic resources. So after extensive and in-depth research on the key issues pertinent to the subject matter, following other key findings, and of course, policy recommendations that emerge. Export concentration in RMG has shown a rising trend over the past 20, 25 years, whereas the share of RMG in export basket was about 60% in FY 2000, it has risen to 83% in FY 21 to 23. RMG exports, 216 of HS codes, have grown much faster than non-RMG exports, about 1,500 HS6 products. If this trend cannot be reversed, export concentration in RMG could reach 90% over the next 5 years. So what is the problem? Is it lack of competitiveness or competitive advantage? Or is it primarily a policy problem? With PRI research team, I've done in-depth research on the issue of competitive advantage by applying, of course, time-tested revealed comparative advantage and normalized NRCA to check how competitive are Bangladesh exports, RMG and non-RMG, relative to competing exports from other exporters to destination countries, relative competitiveness of each of the 216 RMG exports and nearly 1,500 non-RMG exports. The finding was that competitiveness was not the issue. Almost 90% of RMG exports were found to be highly or moderately competitive relative to competing exporters. In the case of non-RMG exports, those with exports greater than $1 million, 2/3 of them we found to be highly or moderately competitive. For the remaining, 1,000 or so non-garment exports with less than $1 million export value, 1/3 of them were found to be highly or moderately competitive. So in total, we have about 500 to 686 products in which Bangladesh has moderate or high competitiveness. So there is no dearth of products. I'm not identifying these products. The list is there. Overall, the conclusion was that competitiveness was not the problem, impeding faster growth of non-RMG exports. Was market access or external demand for non-RMG export the problem? Non-RMG exports have minuscule share of world markets, and world tariffs on non-RMG exports are significantly lower than for RMG or textiles. Trade theory tells us that in this case, there is no demand constraint. Economists who are listening to this speech must know that means they are facing a horizontal demand curve. There is no demand constraint. If competitiveness and demand is not the problem, then what is the problem? Based on our research and my research for the past 25 years, I have come to the conclusion, now acknowledged by multilateral agencies like the World Bank, that there is a fundamental policy problem. It is the anti-export bias of trade policy that makes exporting non-RMG exports less profitable than domestic sales. RMG exports are not affected by this anti-export bias, given that they operate in a duty-free enclave, special bonded warehouse system, etc. And that gives us this trade policy dualism. We have this unique situation in Bangladesh. Trade policy dualism operates in Bangladesh, and one policy for RMG exports and another for the rest. And that is where I think Naseem Mansour's, this good news, but I don't see why it should be limited to just two other non-garment sectors. It should be expanded to all non-garment sectors. Now, that is where the problem lies, I think. Non-RMG export production has a choice of exporting or selling in the domestic market, propped up by high protective tariffs. Profitability in the domestic market far outweigh profitability from exports. Export subsidies plus discounted borrowing costs and other support measures do not make up for the high protective tariffs for import substitute production. When effective incentives are higher for domestic sales than exports, it gives rise to an anti-export bias of policy. For the first time in Bangladesh, and perhaps in any other country, I devised this methodology to measure anti-export bias product by product for the roughly 1,500 non-RMG products and the 216 RMG products. While anti-export bias was almost non-existent for RMG exports, on average, incentives were found to be 30% higher for domestic sale of non-RMG export products. In case of thrust sectors and special development sectors which receive special support measures, we found that anti-export bias was even higher. And this measure has been, we use only the nominal rate of protection. If we used effective rate of protection, then we would have found that effective rate of protection for exports are much less than the effective rate of protection for import substitute products, significantly higher. And I take the example of footwear, which I thought could have been the next RMG, and it is not because of this anti-export bias that this product is subject to. Their effective rate of protection for footwear is in the range of 200% plus, but effective range of protection for export of footwear is only at about 10% or so, with all the export cash subsidy and other support measures. So our number 2 RMG, the second RMG product is just lying low. It should have developed into a real success story. So the policy conclusion, as long as there is anti-export bias of policy, non-RMG export performance and growth will continue to trail RMG export performance, resulting in lack of progress in export diversification. The source of the problem lies in the structure and degree of tariff protection. No amount of export promotion measures, including improvements in trade logistics, trade facilitation, financial access, and so on, can outweigh the profitability of ISI production, import substitute production, under high tariff protection. In the case of non-RMG products, there exists a clear disincentive to export. So the policy choice is obvious. A, do away with the policy dualism. Offer the same policy for non-RMG as is offered to RMG. B, rationalize / reduce protective tariffs and eliminate anti-export bias. The final words, research has revealed one simple truth. If there is no rationalization or reduction in tariff protection, there will be no reduction or elimination of anti-export bias. So policymakers need to be informed in no uncertain terms. Export diversification is impossible if there is no tariff reduction or rationalization and no elimination of anti-export bias. The National Tariff Policy 2023 embraces the right policy choices. Its implementation remains the key. I rest my case. Thank you very much for this opportunity, Sanem and Salim Rahman. I hope I provided some alternative views to your very comprehensive coverage of the state of play in the Bangladeshi economy and how structural transformation is being impeded or undermined with export concentration on another side. Thank you very much again, and thank you, Chair, for allowing me some extra time.
Thank you, Dr. Hello. I'm glad to hear that you think the national tariff policy is in the right direction, and I would advise you to send your 2-page note to the new finance minister, who is now finalizing the FY25 budget. So now it's open for discussion. Please identify yourself if you have any question and observations, and we would appreciate brevity. Go ahead.
Helal Ahmed, Dean School of Business Economics, North-South University. Thank you. It's been a fantastic discussion, and someone who, in a way, is very educated. So my question is, in the space of protected exporters, taking your word, bias, distortionary regulatory framework, practices, and uncertainty. But let me just highlight a few pointers before I go to the question. So there is no shortage of economic theory telling giving some subsidies or benefits to one industry means implicit taxes on others. So there's no shortage of that. Also, various research work I presented today suggests, there should be evidence-based policy reform. But my question is, are the policymakers, our policy wonks and mandarins, listening to this evidence? And that's a billion-dollar question, I guess. But I wish some of the policymakers are here. Anyway, so the point I'm making is, recently we have experienced 30% devaluation thanks to IMF. Don't you think this is the right time to do the policy rationalization? And the other question is, I know policymakers are comfortable in where they are. Do they have the right institutions to undertake that kind of policy architecture? Thank you.
Do you want to collect a few and then? Yeah, so we have next here.
Thank you very much. I would like to express my special thanks to Professor Selim Raihan for his excellent presentation. My name is Ghulam Rasul. I am teaching economics at IUBAT in Dhaka. So the point he raised, particularly the need for structural transformation of Bangladesh economy and bring more complexity moving from the cheap labor-based export, and major constraint coming from policy and regulation. So, of course, policy and regulation is important constraint. There is a claim that there is not much innovation in policy and regulation after 1980s or 90s, and there is going on. So my one question coming to, of course, Professor Selim Raihan, as well as our private sector representative, that now we are listening that yesterday we also listened that now Bangladesh is, our even policy is dominated by the private sector. We call crony capital or whatever. And everything is mostly directly, indirectly influencing in their benefit. So why not private sector is working to really for there, and why we say that anti-business policy, anti-FDI investment policy, all that. So this is one of the major question, and I think we need to answer. And of course, so policy and the regulation constraint is important, but I think Professor Selim Raihan has not given enough emphasis on the point of infrastructure deficiency. Of course, might be under LPI it might have covered, but if you look at the cost of our export or import, even port, transportation, and power, energy, how it makes our competitive or uncompetitive. So I think the point of infrastructure probably need also due attention. You have discussed labor productivity. We are very low. Of course, we know that. And you have nicely showed our expenditure, GDP to education, GDP to health expenditure. We are very low. Actually, I was also looking this data. I saw that Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, these three countries of expenditure to GDP on education, health, almost same. But we look at that Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, very gulf difference. Their expenditure to education to GDP almost same to Bangladesh, but their labor productivity is much higher than us. So it is not only expenditure, it is probably how we spend the expenditure. So that's all. Thank you very much. Very nice session. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm Robiul Islam, and I'm consultant for the Asian Development Bank. My question are two questions, and on the skilled labor. One question is directed to Mr. Nasim Manzoor, and we hear a lot about that there is shortage of skilled labor, and this is also true for the established ready-made garment sector and the leather sector and other sector as well. So why this shortage of skilled labor we cannot address even in the RMG sector? That's then my question, even in the main flagship export sector. And the second question is, we all know that we have been talking about the industry-academia collaboration for a long time to address the skill gaps. but perhaps Sir is here. So perhaps we could also address this, that why this collaboration and changes are not happening, which is also a major roadblock to the export diversification. Thank you.
I don't see, yes, back there.
Thank you. I'm Madhusumana Rajgir. I'm an undergraduate student at the Department of Economics, University of Dhaka. So thank you. So my question is, we already have a low tax GDP ratio here in Bangladesh, and in our country there is a relaxed net. People are usually discouraged to pay income taxes. The system is quite complex, and people want to avoid paying taxes here, and therefore it is seen that we finance a lot of budget by debt. So my question is, in case we reduce the tariff, what is the short-term implications and how to overcome it?
See, 2, 3, 4 more hands. Do you want to take them all now?
I think, yeah.
Okay.
Sir, good afternoon, everyone. I am Mohammad Iftikhar Alam Maruf from the Department of Economics, University of Dhaka. I have 2 questions. So my first question is to Dr. Selim Rayhan, sir. As we have seen that though once Bangladesh and Vietnam were on the same level, but at this point, Bangladesh is not even close to Vietnam. So my question is, what does Bangladesh actually lack for not being able to be at least on the same level as Vietnam? And how does Bangladesh's approach to export diversification and structural transformation differ from or align with the strategies implemented by Vietnam? And my second question is, as we clearly know that Bangladesh will no longer benefit from patent-free clauses of the TRIPS agreement with its graduation from LDC status, what anticipated impacts or opportunities does the pharmaceutical industry foresee post-graduation in terms of global market access, trade agreements, and potential challenges that may arise for the sector? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I'm Sumaya from the Department of Economics, University of Dhaka. My question is to Selim Rayhan, sir, that why are you taking only the 2 countries, Vietnam and India, your comparison with Bangladesh? And the second question is to the panel that there are many problems in our country, that low FDI, lower tax GDP ratio, regularity, uncertainty, and many economics, Dr. Akhtar and Mr. Nasim, Dr. Zaidi, they are also boldly say that about the problems of lower skill, productivity, and institutional problems. But why Bangladesh can't overcome this major problem? We are listening these questions, these problems again and again, but we are also listening the solutions, policies, but why we are not seeing the exact solution there in our country? Why we are not seeing this? What is the problem in our country? Thank you, sir.
Problem behind the problem. Yeah, I think let's start with the PhD first.
Hello. Okay. No, thank you. I think I must thank the panelists because they raised not only some very important points, which complement my presentation, but at the same time, I think they added some very new perspectives as well. I'm very much thankful to them. And also some of the questions which have been raised. I think I may not be able to address all the questions, but let's pick a few of them. When it comes to, I think, the policy reform, I think that is relatively easy. You can write down fantastic policy. If you look at Bangladesh's competition policy, unfortunately, this is kind of very much copied from South African competition policy. Probably one of the best in the world. But the problem is, as Hilal Bhai mentioned, no implementation. You don't have the state capacity to implement it. And you don't actually build the state capacity to implement it. But how do you translate the policy reform into implementation? There is a gap there where you need serious institutional reform. You need to have right kind of institution in place to have these policy reforms actually being implemented. So that is one question, Sumaya, what you raised, why we are not, why we're here and why we are not making progress. One thing is that if you look at the 5 years plan, perspective plan, fantastic things are written there, but hardly they are not taking seriously, even with the ministries, to how to have a proper action plan to implement them. Few things probably I'll say, and I know Zaidi Bhai and I had long discussion earlier too. We had so many agreements and we had few disagreements too. And we always love to have some disagreements. It's not, I would say, disagreement, but I'll just challenge the whole idea of the RMG model of export success. Actually, I have written that. If you look at, we have advertised or we made a promotion of my book, The Institutional Diagnostic and the Bangladesh Paradox Sustainable, where I had a chapter on this ready-made garments RMG model. I challenge that it's not that if you simply have an open liberalized tariff regime and that will have an automatic export success in other sectors, which is a necessary condition. Definitely, we need it. I also highlighted that in my presentation. The tariff rates are extremely high in Bangladesh, average tariff rates. But that's not sufficient. The RMG model of export success is not based on only removing the anti-export bias for the RMG sector. We have serious, as Dr. Jaidisa mentioned, if I call it in that way, we have a serious non-RMG bias, anti and non-RMG bias. That means for the non-RMG sectors, they face a lot of challenges. So what are the challenges? It's not only the tariff, so they have some issues, but I know that Nasim Bhai will tell you a lot of other things too. If the tannery estate in Stavar is not being operationalized, within a decade or so, it takes decades after decades, and it's still not being operational, how do you export? The leather footwear industry export would increase, from $1.5, $1.7 billion to at least $10 billion. So I think this is a fundamental issue of, when you bring in the whole political economy discourse into it. And that is something what I have written in my book on chapter is that you need to look at the way the whole political economy dynamics center around the export diversification issue. Nasir Bhai should tell us how many of their MPs in the attached to leather sector are in the parliament? Zero. How many of the MPs the garment sector have there in parliament? So you can see that they are making their own policies and they're implementing their own policies. So you need to have that kind of political cloud to influence the policymaker, and we have written in other things that it's more of a kind of deals world. I'm not really getting into that discussion. Now coming to other point is that what Dr. Jaideep Sattar, he was referring to about this comparative advantage, revealed comparative advantage, is that we know that it has some limitation in terms of calculation in the sense that it's actually revealed. It is not based on the data you have. So you actually then calculate based on that. And then because we know that the export, what we see, which are observable, the data, may not be the actual export potential of the country. Because the exports which are being exported to other countries, the figure, they face different tariff duties in other countries. At the same time, they face a lot of challenges within the country. So I think we need to be very careful when we say comparative advantage and competitive advantage. These two are very different. You may have competitive advantage in a number of products, but you may not have competitive advantage in many products because you have serious domestic infrastructural issues, high cost of doing business and other things. So I fully agree with Dr. Jaideep Sattar that RCA calculation, in my case, actually it was taken from the UNCTAD's exercise, which was at the 3-digit SITC code, not HS code, and definitely it was at a higher level of aggregation. But my point was to show that even with that 1,500 products what Jaideep Bhai was mentioning, that over the last 20 years, Bangladesh could add only very few products in the export basket, where Vietnam actually increased its what I call the dynamic competitive advantage. It made innovation, expanded their capacity, capabilities to get into new products. That's why it comes to the other question where I think Sumai was mentioning why we compare Bangladesh with Vietnam and India. It's your choice. You may compare Bangladesh with Pakistan. You may compare Bangladesh with any other country. And we know that when the comparison comes, we make our own judgment that which countries we make the benchmark and how we are comparing to. In my view, I think that you need to compare with the better performers, not the worst performers. So because if you compare yourself with the worst performance, you can always feel good that I'm doing better. You need to compare with your better performance. And the comparison of Vietnam is very pertinent. I'm quite sure Nasim Bhai would also agree with that. That in mid-90s or early 90s, Vietnam and Bangladesh had a similar level of development. But then the way the country graduated. And also the fact is that Vietnam is not a small country. It is also has a population of around 90 million to 100 million population. Again, very quickly on the other point, I think there is one issue was revenue implication of tariff. I think I'm quite sure Dr. Jahid Hussain would also answer to that question, that you need to restructure and make a major reform in the taxation sector, and that's seriously lagging. I have shown that in my presentation, because there is a heavy reliance on the indirect taxes. Almost 70% of our taxes come from indirect taxes, and half of it comes from import duties. And you can't actually have a tariff structure like that, and your governments can't actually rely on this tariff revenue and the income generation from this and make it on a sustainable basis and as we aspire to become an upper middle income country in few years from now. So I will stop here, Jaideep Bhai, and if Nasim wants to.
Oh, thank you. I'd like to just add a few more points. I don't know if this is working, but it's working. First of all, I think the specific questions to me, the first one was about, the famous crony capitalism, and I stand corrected or accused as you wish. Why am I not one of them? It's very interesting that, and Salim Bhai knows the frustration. One of these many discussions with the government, we were told the reason you can't, why don't you become an MP? Now, why should everybody have to become an MP to do business in this country? I don't want to become, I have no chance of ever being elected to anything. So I think that should not be the approach. Look, the fact of the matter is RMG has transformed Bangladesh globally. I don't think we should take anything away from that. Today, Made in Bangladesh is a label that we wear proudly, and non-RMG goes to market on the back of what RMG has approved. And I find that even in the RMG sector, there is a clear understanding that they can't just capture everything. They want other sectors to come. So why is this mental block? I'm really amazed that various government agencies, when they issue circulars, SROs, standing orders, it comes out in the name of sectors. For this association, for that association, for this, even for this company. So that capture, sir, that you talked about is unfortunate, but that is a reality in a political economy that you talked about. If you're not part of that, shall I say, group of people, then it's very difficult. Having said that, what do? Do you join that group? No. Now, to the younger people in this room, I think I hear a bit of frustration from the young lady who was talking. Let's not also forget how far we have come. I think really, let's look at this glass as half full at this moment, because what is happening right now is that we are facing unprecedented perfect storm. Slowing of global demand, rising inflation, depreciation of 30%, rising costs, 4 times rise in energy. We have never been in this situation. 2 years ago, we were having a separate conversation. So I think now that we are challenged, we are realizing that what brought us here is not going to get us there. And that's why this conversation is going on. So I think the other point that you made is invest in education leads to higher productivity. Absolutely. I mean, it's a no-brainer again. Sri Lanka, why do we bring the skilled people from Sri Lanka? Sri Lanka, if you do your O-levels, A-levels, or HSC, SSC, after that, You go straight into technical vocational education school. You get a training in industrial engineering, IE, and today an IE manager in Bangladesh is getting $2,500 US to $5,000 US. The UK is talking about not A levels, but T levels, technical levels. Something I've said many times now, Bangladesh, if any of my 4 children want to become vocational education, the family will go into mourning, right? That biye hobe na, ki hobe, welding korte chahe, plumbing korte chahe. That's the reality. Now, a plumber makes more money in New York on an hourly basis than a banker. But ke plumbing porbe? সবাই তো ইউনিভার্সিটিতে ভর্তি হয়ে বিএ করতে চায়, এমবিএ করতে চায়. How many more MBAs and BBAs do we need? We don't. Trust me, we're up to here with the BBAs and MBAs. We need footwear technologists, we need pharmacists, we need food technologists. But young people, I'm old enough, you don't want to do that. You all want to come to our office and work in the office. That's the problem. That's why, my friend, we bring people from outside. I run successful businesses. I find the best people at the best cost. Now, if the production management, none of the talented people in Bangladesh, young people want to work in production. They all want to work in merchandising, fashion, marketing, retail, but they don't want to work in manufacturing. So if you look at the skills gap is not at the lowest level of the rung. It's not at the operator level. Mid-management. Biggest problem is mid-management. Mid-management ki hocche? We are taking half-educated people, I'm sorry to say, and putting them in charge of workers who know more than they know. So obviously productivity is low. Productivity is low hobby. Right? I go to the College of Leather Technology. Everybody wants to graduate and join BCS. Nobody wants to work in the factory. Everybody wants to work in BCS. The skills gap happen at the ki hobe. How many more people is the government going to hire? So we have a real problem here with also expectation. Now, very quickly, the other point about industry-academia linkage. Yeah, great topic, talking about it for 22 years now. Number one, create tax incentives. The reason that people give money to Harvard or to Manchester or to Cambridge is there is a tax write-off. Please understand, there is money behind everything, right? So when you give money to a university, it's applied research. I can commission research by any of these fine people and say, how does it impact our business? I can take it to my shareholders, effective. NBR ke onek bar bola hoyeche. Why don't we make donations to universities tax efficient so that you can then finance funded research? Eta hocche na, and that is why there is a discharge. Now, very quickly, Dr. Zahid said it beautifully. Bangladesh seems to be tiring in the process of development. Ami abaro bolbo. What got us here is pretty good. We've reached a position, but the next level is going to be more difficult. So a tiring jagah theke we need to come out of this political economy, crony capitalism that talk. Now let's talk about specifics. The tax rate, the corporate tax rate for RMG, if you are a green factory, is 10% and 12% if you're non-RMG. Guess how much it is for everybody else? 27.5%. So the biggest mistake I made is I didn't go into RMG. Why? What is the problem? Okay? So I don't blame RMG for this. I blame the policy makers. Why this dual policy treatment? So we need to correct that, and I think it needs to happen faster. Last but not least, I'm going to again repeat something that Dr. Salim Raj said. You cannot have high level of export concentration and high structural transformation. The two are mutually exclusive. But structural transformation of what? I think as Dr. Zaidi said, we need to transform policy implementation. We have the best policy on paper. None of it gets implemented fast enough. That is where the challenge is. Thank you very much.
Have they missed any question?
I think I missed...
Your question?
I know, expense of repeating. Is it the right time when devaluation is supporting exports to reduce export subsidies? That's the implicit assumption.
No, the chairman don't answer questions, sir.
No, I think we have such a, anyway. I think I missed one or two points. One is that, what is the kind of what is the story behind the success of Vietnam? Especially the way you see that kind of difference, the divergence between Bangladesh, Vietnam, and to some extent between India and Vietnam too. In Vietnam, in the early 2000s, 20 years from now, more than 20 years from now, they started the economic reform, they call it Doi Moi. And this economic reform, they complemented with the educational reform. They did the education reform and economic reform together. And if you read Economist, the last year, sometime in September, they published one article that why the schools in Vietnam are so good, because the kind of incentives they provide in the education sector, both for the teachers and students to get the very high level of make them high skilled. And about the depreciation and the, so did you have any choice? You had choice. Few years back, you could gradually adjust to the market-based interest rate because you had enough or kind of strong flow of export and remittance. But now you don't have any choice. You have to depreciate further. Either you forcefully do it, or you still keep the very artificially several exchange rates where the official rate is 110 around, or outside you get more than 130 taka. So I think you don't have much choice. You had choice in the earlier when you had the luxury of doing the reform, but you do not do it. Now you don't have any option. So that's my point.
Can I just add to that? I think the specific question about is this the right time to take off the incentive? My answer is no. And I'll tell you why. I think when you have high cost of doing business compared to everything else, let's look at any of the factors of production. Utility, gone up 400%. Interest rate, now at 13%, trending to 15%. Transport, we're talking about logistics. Cost per kilometer, one of the highest in the world. Let's reduce the cost of doing to a business to a level where we can be globally competitive. We don't need the subsidies. We don't need the incentives. But I think this haste to take away the incentives at a time when Bangladesh has an opportunity. I'll tell you why I'm hopeful. If you talk about some of the biggest brands in the world, whether it's Walmart, whether it's Nike, they all have mandates to get out of China. And there is a now global fight for where this production is going to go. I personally believe Bangladesh can take some of that manufacturing space. But you need to create that competence right now. So if you can attract that investment and hold on, create those scale, you can bring down your costs. But you're not there yet. I'll give you one example. When we bring a foreign buyer to Bangladesh, the cost of staying in a 5-star hotel in Bangladesh is like New York. There is no reason for it to be so expensive. Do you not think that affects our cost of doing business? Does that not get factored into our cost of product? Yes. So let's bring our costs down to a point where we can be competitive. We don't want any of this. Now, export financing in other countries is single digit. We're at 13%. Our interest rates are higher. Our utilities are higher. Our transport costs are higher. Our wages have to go up. So how do you capture? You capture by incentive. So 2026 is still further off. This is a time where I believe you hold, you capture share, you increase scale, and then you drop. I think we're doing it prematurely. That's my personal opinion.
There's a question in the Zoom chat box. I'll just take it as a comment. Can I read it? Please. Okay, there is a question in the Zoom chat box. There are questions or comments. I'll just read it because I don't think we have time to respond to this. So the question comes from Mahatabuddin. He's doing PhD at the Manchester University. So he said one opinion, one question. First, the question is, in Bangladesh, land registration, land allocation, etc. are some of the most difficult, time-consuming process. Meanwhile, Vietnam introduced Land Reform Act in the early 90s and was successful in implementing them. It might be one of the major factors that made Vietnam lower their cost of doing business. So that is one. And then also he said that one advantage that Vietnam has, is that they have a strong cultural and historical links to Chinese ethnicity. A large number of initial FDIs in Vietnam were actually from Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and the southeastern province of China, and still. So that is his comment. So thank you, Mahtab, for sharing your views.
So I think we have run out of time. I mean, there were a couple of more hands.
Please, I think we can, yeah, quickly.
Yes.
Hello, this is Samia, BSc final year student of economics at Jahangir University. So today we saw from both sides, we've talked about how we lag in raising tax revenues, we are, our tax to GDP ratio is quite low. And on the other hand, we are also talking about tax breaks, tax holidays as incentives, for manufacturers and exporters, which is also necessary. So I was wondering if there is any way that where we could integrate, this tax export promotional facilities to raise tax revenues. For example, the jute industry, the leather industry, the industries which are requesting for the bonded warehouse and facilities and such. We could extend those facilities only if they meet certain taxation criteria. Is it possible to do that, or will that reduce competitiveness? So that's my first question. And I have another. Should I move forward?
Quickly.
Okay. We talked about STI index, and that without reducing the concentration ratio, we can't really, perform better in STI. That was the conclusion from the presentation. And yes, although reducing concentration ratio is very important altogether, but with that in mind, can we actually improve in the STI index by increasing our domestic value addition in the manufacturing sector? For example, in garment sector, the value addition is like just 66%. So by improving it, can we, perform better? Thank you.
Yes, Dr. Bazlul Hakim. Go ahead.
Okay, my name is Zayed and I'm from SAEC in Bangladesh. So we were talking about we are running behind Vietnam. So I have just comments here. We don't talk about less wage and remuneration of our labor. Also our labor, garments worker, they have to do protest, do movement, to just for their wage. So we are not talking about their less payment, less remuneration, and we are talking about to going far from Vietnam. Yeah. So what's your comment or insight about these topics? Thank you.
Excuse me. This is Imdad Haq. I'm working with Channel 24 as a senior reporter. This discussion includes a lot of government system and policy. I think someone from government side should be included in this discussion. We are just missing some of their views. Second one, to Mr. Nasim Manzoor, your presentation always attractive to us, including the audience. But we are used to hearing a lot of problems to run a new business, bringing for FDI, such types of. But I just want to know, what's the role of our business leaders to solve out this problem actually? As per we know, more than 60% MPs are in this parliament from business background. Thank you.
Thank you.
This should be the last one.
Yeah, last one. Yeah, it's working. It's working. It's working. I think it's working. I have one observation and one question. One observation, as Zahid Bhai was saying, we are also suffering from, I think, development complacence. If you see that our growth rate is increasing by 7%, our poverty reduction is extreme poverty is almost 5%. We are almost in the full employment regime in that way. So I think there is a policy, development complacence within the government circle. As Nasim Bhai was saying, I was also sometime, I think, flabbergasted by seeing that we don't need this, we don't need that. So I think that's a development complacence, I think, from that. My second question, or one question to Selim and other also, Selim is doing a lot of political economics issue. We have some success in terms of reform, as Nasim was saying that there is no reform in that way. My question is that, whom should we look for reform? Is the politician or bureaucrats? Thank you.
I'll start and then Nasim Bhai can join. The question on the taxation, I think, especially relating to the export sector, is very important. How do you really reform the tax sector? I think there have been many discussions around that, but unfortunately we don't actually have much progress. So that's why what you see in the taxation sector, as the Nasim Bhai was saying, that in 1 year in the budget you see some percentage, and in the following year it's different, depending, and then probably it is proposed in the budget, but a few months later you see that that has been changed because of the bargaining of some sector of the private sector, so section of the private sector. So that, what does it mean? It means that the whole policy regime in this particular case is very ad hoc. It's not really very strategic, it's not very well thought, and then definitely the challenge I talked about, the implementation issue. I think I fully agree about the value addition aspect of export, but in order to improve the value addition of the export, then you need to actually have more skilled labor, more other areas you need to have improvement. I think I tried to focus on that particular issue. There's a very important point, what you mentioned about the labor issue. I think you raised that point. That was part of my analysis in my chapter on the ready-made garments. The whole RMG model of export success had a built-in what I call the strong political settlement to maintain the labor regime in a way that the labor, you overlook the labor conditions, working conditions, and also suppress the wage, to an extent. And you remember Professor Yanatul Islam, what he presented yesterday, the way the minimum wage is the lowest in Bangladesh compared to many other countries.
So I think this is a very important issue. Same thing, the way labor is managed, it's the same thing you can't replicate in other sectors. So that means the RMG model, what we see, is not really replicable to other sectors. Thank you. Nasim Bhai.
Yeah, I think the question about how to increase the tax GDP ratio while at the same time giving industry the kind of incentives or support that it's a very powerful question. And my simple answer is you have to increase the net. In Bangladesh, I've been saying for many years, those of us who pay tax, we pay for us and we pay for those who don't pay. Same thing for bank interest. We pay for us and we pay for those who don't pay. So depending on which side of that fence you are, unfortunately I'm on that wrong side. So I think, if you saw one of the slides that Dr. Rehan shared, business has identified the ease of paying tax, or the complexity of paying tax. Many people are afraid to pay tax because once you come under that net, because there is so much, so the onus is always on those who pay. Instead of going after people who don't pay, and we see their quality of life, we see the standard of living, they should pay. So I think this is where, it's very easy to say, why don't we just bring more people under the tax net instead of just taxing those who already pay? Let me just correct you. There is no special taxation for anybody other than, of course, our friends in RMG. We all pay the same tax rate other than RMG. Value addition of export. Once again, I would slightly disagree with something that was said here, that we shouldn't be picking champions. I think we should be. I don't think Bangladesh can afford to have 1,300 potential winners. We will never be potential winners in 1,300. Taiwan is semiconductors, Thailand is agro, India is ITES. You need to pick winners, whatever. I hope we are in that group, maybe we are not. But on a certain basis, and I believe the basis should be number 1, job creation, number 2, value addition, number 3, export potential. On those 3 counts, jute, agro, and leather, no bias, of course, comes into that group. So I think this is where you need to pick. Now, with all due respect, we say we're going to export dried fish. No disrespect to dried fish. What is the market for dried fish? How much money are we going to earn? How long will it take us to get to $1 billion in dried fish? I don't think that's the way to look at it. We need to look at where we have big wins in the lowest possible time. So I think we need to pick winners. The question from my friend in Channel 24. What is the role of business leaders? 60% of the MPs are business people. I don't think most of them are in manufacturing, my friend. Certainly not in export. In India also it's the same story. People identify themselves as farmers because the tax is lowest. Most of the people in the Indian parliament are farmers. I don't know what the businesses our MPs are in. Yes, you can say that we should have more voice, but I think to the question from Bazul Bhai, that whose responsibility is to implement? Is it the politicians or is it the bureaucrat? The answer is, of course, both. And it comes to the final question of accountability and governance. If you don't have good governance and accountability, none of this is going to work. So we have seen great ministers in the past. I recall with great respect Mr. Mohit, Mr. Tofail Ahmed, who were great ministers supported by great bureaucrats. And they worked with industry. Where they agreed with industry, they supported. Where they disagreed, they didn't support. So, of course, business will lobby for getting what we want. But then it is up to the politically representative members of society, as well as the bureaucrat. It has to be inclusive of everybody. It cannot be just one group. And the development complacency that you talked about, I think the same thing is true also of the private sector. I think we have come to a point where we've gotten away with inefficiencies for so long, we don't understand now the time. So now it's a wake-up call. So once again, I think the time is now. There is an opportunity now. There is massive relocation happening of manufacturing from China out. It's on us whether we can capture it or not. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think in Bangladesh it's the fishermen. In India it's farmers, right? I mean, we heard this. It's fisheries. And I think I just want to disagree with you, Nasim, slightly on a question that came from here, is that maybe it's not the right time to take away the incentive, but I think it is about time we assess that whether this regime has achieved the objectives it was expected to achieve. It clearly has not. So, and thank you all for your very lively participation, particularly the young students here. And thank you, Salim Rehan, for doing this, and the panelists for your contribution. That's it.